The stone moves in color as the sun climbs. At first light, the cliffs surrounding the city are the deep amber of dried blood. An hour later, they shift toward coral. By midday, they are almost pink, a rose-tinged sandstone that catches and holds warmth the way few rocks do, radiating it back into the air long after the sun has moved on. By late afternoon, some faces of the cliff glow close to gold. The shift is continuous. The rock never looks exactly the same twice. This is the Wadi Musa Basin in southern Jordan, a high desert valley enclosed on all sides by fractured Nubian sandstone cliffs, accessible from the surrounding plateau only through narrow gorges cut by ancient water. The landscape seems designed for concealment. You could pass within 3 kilometers of this valley and never know it was there. That may have been deliberate. The people who chose this place for their capital understood concealment the way most civilizations understand walls. They built no defensive perimeter around Petra. They did not need one. The terrain was the defense. The approach through the Sick, the deep, winding rock fissure that serves as the main entrance, allows a handful of defenders to stop an army. The city itself, spread across a basin of carved cliffs and built terraces, is invisible from every direction until you are already inside it. But the Nabataeans, who built Petra over several centuries beginning around the 4th century BC, did not simply hide in a difficult landscape. They transformed it. They cut facades into sheer cliff faces with a precision that still draws engineers to study them. They engineered a water supply system across a terrain with almost no permanent water in one of the driest regions of the ancient world. They controlled the most profitable trade routes of their era without raising a standing army large enough to appear in any historical record. And then, with a completeness that is unusual even by the standards of ancient civilizations, they receded. Their language became the script of their conquerors. Their gods were absorbed into Rome's religious catalogue. Their city was buried under wind-blown sediment for more than 1,000 years before a European explorer followed a Bedouin guide through the Siq and recognized what he was looking at. The question that Petra poses, quietly in the particular silence of its rose-colored cliffs, is not simply how it was built. It is how a civilization this sophisticated left so little of itself behind to explain who it was. To understand what makes Petra genuinely unusual, you need to first understand what the conventional account offers, and it offers quite a lot. According to conventional history, the Nabataeans were a Semitic-speaking people of North Arabian origin who established themselves in the Petra region sometime in the 4th century BC, following the collapse of Edomite control over the area. Early accounts of them, from Greek and Diodorus Siculus in the 3rd century BC, describe a people actively resisting settlement, fiercely protective of their independence, and already expert in the desert trade routes that connected Arabia to the Mediterranean world. Researchers generally agree that the transformation of Petra from a seasonal or semi-permanent camp into a permanent, architecturally sophisticated capital took place over the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. This timeline is supported by ceramic evidence, by the dating of the earliest carved tomb facades, and by written references in Greek and Latin sources that describe the city in terms suggesting established urban character. The Nabataean kingdom reached its territorial peak roughly between 100 BC and 100 AD. At its greatest extent, the kingdom controlled territory stretching from the Hijaz in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia, northward through the Negev, across the Sinai, and into what is now Syria. Petra sat at the organizational center of this territory, connected to its edges by a network of road stations, wells, and agricultural installations. The trade flowing through this network was substantial. Frankincense and myrrh, combustible resins harvested in southern Arabia and essential to religious rituals across the entire Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, passed northward through Nabataean-controlled territory. So did spices, silk, and luxury goods from further east that arrived via the Arabian Peninsula from Indian Ocean trade networks. The Nabataeans did not produce these commodities. They moved them, taxed them, and stored them at way stations across their desert domain. Archaeologists currently believe this economic function is what explains Petra's location, scale, and longevity. A city in a waterless, agriculturally marginal desert makes sense only if it is generating wealth through something other than agriculture. And Petra's wealth came from trade, specifically from the unique geographic and logistical position the Nabataeans had established over generations of desert expertise. The carved architecture that Petra is famous for, the elaborate facades cut directly into the sandstone cliff faces, represents the material expression of this wealth. The most iconic of these, the building known since the 19th century as the Treasury or Al-Khazne, is carved into a cliff at the far end of the Sikh. Its facade rises roughly 43 meters, comprises 2 stories of columns, pediments, and sculpted figures, and was cut from the living rock outward, meaning the sculptors removed stone rather than adding it, working from top to bottom in a process that modern engineers have studied with considerable interest. The treasury is probably a royal tomb. Most researchers who have worked on the site support this interpretation, though the interior is a single, undecorated chamber and no human remains consistent with a royal burial have been confirmed inside it. The scale and placement, immediately at the end of the Esik, framed by the narrowing gorge walls to create a dramatic reveal to arriving visitors, suggest a building designed to impress, to signal authority, to make a statement to everyone who entered the city. After roughly 5 centuries of independence, the Nabataean kingdom was peacefully absorbed into the Roman Empire in 106 AD under Emperor Trajan. The province was renamed Arabia Petraea. Roman-style construction, a colonnaded street, a theatre, baths, a marketplace, was added to the existing Nabataean city. Petra continued to function as a regional centre for several more centuries. Then the trade routes shifted. The Red Sea became the preferred corridor for goods from the east, bypassing the overland desert routes. Petra's commercial rationale weakened. A severe earthquake in 363 AD damaged many structures. The population declined. By the early Islamic period, the city was largely empty. The Crusaders built a small fort on the high plateau above in the 12th century, but did not resettle the valley below. Wind-blown sediment filled the spaces between the rock-cut facades. The tomb entrances were buried. The colonnaded street disappeared beneath meters of alluvial deposit. When Johann Ludwig Burckhardt arrived in 1812, what had once been a city of tens of thousands was home to a small community of Bedouin who had been living quietly among the tombs for generations. That is the accepted account. It is coherent, well documented in its broad outlines, and supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. It is also in specific and important places incomplete. Stand at the base of the treasury and look up. The facade is approximately 43 meters high and 30 meters wide. Every element of it, the columns, the capitals, the pediments, the decorative urns, the sculpted human and animal figures, was cut from the cliff face. None of it was built up from separate pieces. The entire composition emerged from a single mass of sandstone as the carvers worked their way down from the top. This top-down working method is confirmed by the tool marks and by the absence of scaffolding anchor holes at the base of the facade. The carvers worked from platforms suspended from above as the face was progressively revealed. The upper portions of the facade were cut first, while the lower portions were still solid rock. A design error made at the top could not be corrected from below. It could only be masked by adjusting the elements that came after it. The proportional consistency of the treasury facade, from the uppermost broken pediment to the base-level columns, is striking to structural engineers who have analyzed it. Modern photogrammetric surveys, using thousands of overlapping photographs to create precise 3-dimensional models, reveal that the column diameters, intercolumn spacings, and proportional relationships between architectural elements are consistent to a degree that implies careful pre-planning and accurate dimensional control during execution. Achieving that consistency while working from top to bottom in a medium that cannot be added to once removed, using suspended platforms whose position shifted with each day's work, represents a technical challenge that is difficult to fully convey. There is no surviving drawing of the treasury facade, no architectural plan, no record of who designed it or what reference system the carvers used to maintain dimensional accuracy across a 43-meter height, while working in sections they could not all see simultaneously. The sandstone itself adds another layer of complexity. Nubian sandstone is not uniform in hardness or grain orientation. Different strata within the same cliff face have different working properties. Some layers cut cleanly, others tend to flake along bedding planes that do not align with the carver's intended surface. The tool marks visible on the treasury facade show that the carvers adjusted their working angle and tool pressure in response to the changing stone character as they cut. This adaptation was continuous and expert. The variations in the stone did not produce visible errors in the finished surface. Where the geology made one approach problematic, the carvers shifted technique without compromising the overall design. That level of responsiveness implies long experience with this specific material in this specific environment. Not general masonry expertise, but deep familiarity with the particular behavior of Petra sandstone under iron tools, the kind of knowledge that accumulates over generations of working the same rock. Now consider the scale of the carved landscape beyond the treasury. Petra contains more than 800 tombs of varying scale, spread across the cliff faces of the central basin and extending into subsidiary valleys around it. These tombs range from simple niches barely large enough for a single burial to multi-chamber complexes with elaborately carved facades several stories high. The largest of them, the Palace Tomb and the Corinthian Tomb on what is called the Royal Tomb facade, together span more than 45 meters of cliff face and stand roughly 30 meters tall, carving 800 separate architectural features into the cliff faces of a city, while simultaneously constructing freestanding buildings on the valley floor, maintaining a water supply system for a population estimated between 20,000 and 30,000 people, and managing the logistics of a major regional trade hub. This represents a sustained organizational effort whose full scope is rarely captured by accounts that focus on individual, iconic structures. The water system deserves particular attention in this context because it is the part of Petra's engineering that has most surprised researchers studying it in detail. The basin that Petra occupies receives an average of roughly 150 millimeters of rain per year, concentrated in short, intense winter storms that arrive unpredictably and generate flash floods of significant destructive force. The surrounding highlands receive somewhat more, and the spring at Ain Musa, located about 5 kilometers from the city center, provides a modest but consistent flow. The Nabataeans built a water management system that simultaneously captured and stored rainfall, directed flash flood water away from inhabited areas before it could destroy structures, and delivered spring water to the city through a pipeline system operating under hydraulic pressure. These are 3 separate engineering functions requiring 3 separate categories of infrastructure, all operating across the same terrain and often intersecting with each other. Detailed surveys of the system conducted since the 1990s have identified more than 50 kilometers of water channels, pipelines, and associated features within and around the city. That figure keeps rising as survey work extends to less studied peripheral areas of the site. What this extended survey has revealed is not just scale, but integration. The components of the system are not independent features. They are interconnected in ways that required their designers to think about the system as a whole, modeling how water would move through the landscape under different rainfall conditions, and engineering each component to function correctly within that larger picture. We do not know who designed it. We do not have the names of the engineers. We do not have the working drawings, if any existed. What we have are the channels still holding their gradients, the cistern still sealed with the same hydraulic plaster, the pipeline sections still jointed with the same socket and seal configuration. The system endured. The knowledge that built it did not. There is a dimension of Petra's archaeology that generates quiet but persistent disagreement among specialists, not dramatic enough to produce public controversy, but substantive enough that the leading researchers in the field hold positions that cannot all be correct simultaneously. The most significant of these concerns, the origin and development of the Nabataean architectural tradition that produced the carved facades. The mainstream interpretation held by the majority of researchers who have worked extensively at Petra is that the carved tomb architecture evolved locally from simpler precursors, beginning with plain niches cut into rock faces, gradually developing into more elaborate single-story facades and eventually reaching the full Hellenistic-influenced multi-story compositions seen in the treasury and the royal tombs. The timeline implied by this evolution, working from the ceramic dating of the earliest burials, spans roughly the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD. A different reading of the architectural sequence, advanced by a smaller group of researchers, challenges parts of this developmental story. Their argument centers on the abruptness of certain transitions in the sequence, the jump from relatively simple one-story facade types to the full compositional complexity of a structure like the treasury, with its 2-story elevation, its mixed Hellenistic architectural vocabulary, its refined proportional system, is, in their assessment, more sudden than a purely local developmental process would predict. This does not lead these researchers to invoke outside intervention or lost civilizations. The argument is more specific, that the Nabataeans at some point had access to experienced Hellenistic architects or architectural pattern books, probably through their extensive commercial contacts with the Greek-influenced world of the Eastern Mediterranean, and that this external input compressed what might otherwise have been a longer developmental arc. The mainstream view does not deny Hellenistic influence. It simply places that influence as one factor among several, rather than as a primary explanation for the compositional leap. The dispute is partly about the physical evidence and partly about methodology. Dating the carved facades precisely is genuinely difficult. The rock itself cannot be dated. The original deposits inside the tomb chambers, pottery, coins, organic material, were in many cases disturbed by later reuse of the tombs as dwellings or storage spaces by the Bedouin communities who lived at the site before modern archaeological work began. Where the datable material has been removed or mixed, researchers must rely on stylistic analysis, which is inherently more subjective. Not all researchers agree on how reliably stylistic sequences can be established for an architectural tradition as unusual as Petra's carved facades. A tomb that looks early by Hellenistic stylistic criteria might have been deliberately archaizing, consciously using older-looking forms for cultural or political reasons. A tomb that looks late might have been a conservative patron's commission in a period when more elaborate styles were already available. These ambiguities are not unresolvable in principle. More careful stratigraphic excavation of undisturbed tomb deposits, combined with better scientific dating methods applied to organic material found in sealed contexts, could sharpen the chronology considerably. But the resource and time demands of careful stratigraphic excavation at a site as large and complex as Petra mean that progress is necessarily slow. A second area of friction concerns the political structure of the Nabataean kingdom and its relationship to Petra's physical layout. The conventional picture presents Petra as a capital city in a relatively straightforward sense, the seat of a hereditary monarchy, with the king's authority expressed in the scale and placement of the royal tombs and the main ceremonial structures. The king list is partially reconstructed from coins, inscriptions, and references in external sources. Several queens are also attested with unusual prominence, suggesting a political culture in which female authority was more visible than in many contemporary societies. Some researchers have questioned whether the concept of a centralized monarchy maps cleanly onto the Nabataean political reality at different periods of the kingdom's history. The evidence for decentralized authority, regional governors, merchant families with substantial independent power, a council-like structure alongside or beneath the royal family, is scattered but present. Under this reading, Petra was less the seat of a unified central government and more the ceremonial and commercial hub of a looser political federation whose coherence depended substantially on shared commercial interest. The physical layout of the city offers some support for both readings and decisive support for neither. In 1993, a Jordanian archaeological team working in the area immediately in front of the treasury made a discovery that did not fit neatly into the existing account of the building's function. Beneath the sandy floor of the open area facing the facade, they found a series of carefully arranged burials. Not a single tomb, but a cemetery, multiple individuals, interred over what appeared to be an extended period, in a location immediately adjacent to the most prominent facade in the city. The presence of burials in front of the treasury was not entirely surprising in itself. What was unexpected was the arrangement and the apparent continuity of use. The burials suggest that the open space in front of the treasury, the area where tour groups now congregate to photograph the facade, was treated as sacred ground over a span of time that may have predated the treasury facade itself. This means the treasury was not built into an empty piece of cliff. It was built into a landscape that was already ritually significant, already associated with the dead, already in some sense consecrated. The placement of the facade may have been chosen not simply for visual impact, but to insert a new structure into an existing sacred geography. This reframes the building in a way that the standard account does not fully accommodate. If the treasury was built to define and formalize a space that already had ritual meaning, then understanding what came before it, what earlier structures or practices gave that space its significance, becomes relevant to understanding why it was built where it was and why it looks the way it does. The earlier history of the treasury site is almost completely unresolved. Go deeper into the physical fabric of the city, and a second complication emerges. Detailed geological survey of the Petra basin has identified a fault system running beneath the city, a network of tectonic fractures that has shaped the topography of the valley and continues to generate occasional seismic activity in the region. The earthquake of 363 AD, which historical sources describe as causing widespread damage, was almost certainly amplified by this local fault system. What the geological survey also revealed is that the Nabataeans were aware of the fault pattern and worked around it in ways that are not always immediately obvious. Several of the largest carved tomb complexes on the royal tomb facade are positioned to exploit natural fracture planes in the rock, using existing fissures as the edges of architectural elements rather than cutting across them. This reduces the risk of large-scale spalling along bedding planes during the carving process and produces a more stable finished surface. Identifying the fracture geometry well enough to exploit it in this way requires either systematic observation of how the rock behaves when cut across versus along its natural planes, or direct knowledge of the subsurface structure. Knowledge that would have had to be accumulated through experience with this specific rock body. This raises the possibility that the Nabataean carvers were working from a mental map of the cliff's internal geology, not a formal geological model, but an empirical understanding of where the rock was reliable and where it was not. Such a map would be the product of many generations of quarrying and cutting in this particular landscape. How far back that experience stretched is a question the current evidence cannot definitively answer. Now consider the water system from a different angle. The pipeline delivering water from Ain Musa to the city interior does not follow the most direct route between source and destination. It takes a longer path, curving along the cliff faces of the Sikh rather than cutting across the valley floor, in a way that maintains a consistent downward gradient and avoids terrain features that would have required the pipeline to dip below its hydraulic pressure threshold. This routing decision implies that the designers understood hydraulic pressure behavior in closed pipelines, that a pipe which dips below a certain elevation relative to its source will experience pressure conditions that compromise the sealed joints and eventually cause the system to fail. Working around that constraint in a landscape as topographically irregular as the Sikh required solving a three-dimensional routing problem with a hydrological criterion that is not immediately obvious from the surface terrain. We have no Nabataean text describing this understanding, no engineering manual. The pipeline's routing is the only evidence that the understanding existed. In 2016, archaeologists using satellite imagery identified a large rectangular enclosure on the plateau above the city, roughly 184 meters by 161 meters in dimension, that had not appeared in any previous systematic map of the Petra site. Ground survey confirmed the feature was real, a substantial stone-built structure, significantly larger than any previously known freestanding building at Petra. Its function is still being investigated. The scale places it in a different category from residential or commercial architecture. Some researchers have suggested a military or administrative function. Others have noted that the orientation of the enclosure shows a relationship to the main axis of the city below that is unlikely to be coincidental. This reframes what we thought we understood about Petra's physical extent. The city did not end at the cliff edges of the central basin. It extended upward onto the plateaus in ways that the century of archaeological work focused on the valley floor had not fully captured. What else on the surrounding plateaus remains unmapped is an open question. The carved landscape itself contains a feature that receives less analytical attention than its prominence warrants. High on the cliffs above the central city, cut into the sandstone at a height that would have required significant effort to reach, are dozens of carved niches and bas-relief figures, deities, votary offerings, divine representations, positioned to face specific directions across the basin below. Some of these face the sunrise at particular times of year. Others appear to be oriented toward the treasury or other major facade monuments visible from their position. The systematic mapping of these high-elevation carvings and their orientations has not been completed. Accessing them requires technical climbing, and the number of individual features across the surrounding cliffs runs into the hundreds. A full orientation survey, measuring where each carving faces and what it can see from its position, would take years. What the partial evidence suggests is that the vertical dimension of Petra's carved landscape was as deliberately organized as the horizontal one. The city was not just a floor plan, it was a three-dimensional spatial composition, with the cliff faces functioning as surfaces that encoded meaning at heights visible to specific viewers in specific positions. The full logic of that composition has not been decoded. Rock-cut architecture, buildings carved directly into cliff faces or excavated from solid rock, appears independently across multiple ancient civilizations, and the parallels with Petra illuminate aspects of the Nabataean achievement that are easy to underestimate. In Lycia, the southwestern coast of modern Turkey, the tombs of the ancient Lycian civilization, dating to the 4th and 5th centuries BC, are cut into coastal cliffs with an architectural vocabulary drawn from local timber construction. The Lycians translated the forms of wood frame buildings, beams, log-end terminals, pitched roofs, directly into stone, producing a hybrid architectural language that is unique to their culture and their material context. The scale of individual Lycian tombs is modest compared to Petra's largest facades, but the principle is structurally identical. A civilization that identifies cliff faces as the appropriate medium for expressing its relationship to death and memory. At Ajanta in India, Buddhist monks carved an extensive complex of monastery halls and worship spaces into a basalt cliff face over a period spanning the 2nd century BC to the 5th century AD. The Ajanta caves are celebrated primarily for their painted interior murals, but the carved architecture is equally sophisticated. Vaulted ceilings, elaborately columned facades, and interior spaces whose proportions were worked out in a medium that, like Petra's sandstone, cannot be corrected once removed. What Petra, Lycia, and Ajanta share is not cultural connection. None of these three traditions demonstrably influence the others. What they share is a set of constraints that rock-cut architecture imposes on any civilization that practices it, and a set of solutions that any sufficiently skilled tradition develops in response to those constraints. The parallel is instructive because it suggests that certain aspects of Petra's technical achievement were not unique to the Nabataeans. They were rediscovered independently by any group that worked seriously with stone cliffs as architectural surfaces. The Nabataean achievement was not the invention of these techniques, it was the scale at which they were applied and the integration of rock-cut architecture into a functioning desert city with a sophisticated water management system and a regional commercial network. The water management parallel is equally revealing. The Nabataean runoff agriculture system in the Negev desert, terraced hillsides with precisely placed stone lips that slow and direct rainfall runoff toward cultivated plots, has been studied by researchers in Israel and Jordan for several decades. What that research has consistently found is that the system was more precisely calibrated than it appears at first. The stone lip heights, the terrace widths, and the catchment area geometry are sized in proportions that maximize the ratio of water captured to land area used, given the specific rainfall regime of the region. The same basic principle, distributed collection across a large catchment area rather than dependence on a single large source, appears independently in ancient Sri Lanka, in pre-Columbian southwestern North America, and in ancient Yemen, the homeland of the Arabian trade goods that made Petra's wealth possible. The convergence is environmental. In a landscape where rain is scarce and unpredictable, the distributed approach outperforms the concentrated approach in every dry year that a concentrated system's single source runs short. The Nabataeans arrived at this approach in their particular landscape. So did the ancient Yemenis who farmed the same general climate zone 1,000 kilometers to the south. The intellectual content of the solution is similar. The tools, the materials, and the scale are all different. There is a class of discovery at ancient sites that tends to revise established interpretations significantly, and Petra has produced several examples over the past 30 years. The cemetery in front of the treasury, described earlier, is one. The large plateau enclosure identified from satellite imagery in 2016 is another. A third is the discovery, through geophysical survey in the 2010s, of what appears to be a large buried monumental structure beneath the open area in front of the Qasr al-Bint, the main freestanding temple in the valley floor. The Qasr al-Bint is already the largest freestanding building at Petra, its walls still standing to a height of more than 20 meters in places. A buried structure beneath the plaza in front of it would suggest that the temple's current configuration is a later phase overlying an earlier one, that the site has a stratigraphic history considerably deeper than the visible surface implies. Excavation of the buried feature has not been completed. Its dimensions and character remain partially known. But each of these discoveries has moved in the same direction, toward a Petra that is larger, older, more complex, and more deeply layered than the account based on the visible surface suggested. Each revision has been incremental, not dramatic. None has required abandoning the conventional framework entirely, but cumulatively, they create a pattern. The standard account consistently underestimates the site. Here is what we can say with confidence. We can measure the treasury facade to millimeter precision using photogrammetric survey. We can map the water system channels and quantify their gradient tolerances. We can date the main construction phases within a half-century using ceramic stratigraphy. We can calculate the volume of stone removed to create the carved tomb complexes. We can trace the extent of the trade network through coin distributions and the geographic spread of Nabataean pottery styles. That is a substantial body of knowledge, accumulated over more than a century of archaeological work at one of the most studied sites in the Middle East. And yet, we do not have a single document written by a Nabataean that describes Petra. Not an administrative text, not a religious narrative, not a builder's account. The Nabataean Aramaic inscriptions that survive, numbering in the thousands, spread across their territorial range, are almost entirely funerary and votive. Names of the dead, dedications to deities, brief records of commercial transactions. They tell us who died at Petra and in whose honor dedications were made, and occasionally what things cost. They do not tell us what the treasury was called in its own time by the people who built it. They do not tell us what the Nabataeans believed happened to a person after death, the theology that made the massive investment in tomb architecture meaningful. They do not tell us how the decision was made to build a carved city in a desert gorge rather than a constructed one on open ground. They do not tell us what the psyche meant to someone arriving through it for the first time, from the inside of the culture that created that approach. This is a particular kind of silence. It is not the silence of a civilization that did not write. The Nabataeans wrote extensively, and their script became the ancestor of the Arabic alphabet used across the modern world. It is the silence of a civilization that wrote about some things and not others, and that the things it did not write about happen to be the things we most want to know. The Nabataeans built this. They chose this gorge with this geometry, leading to this cliff with this facade at its end. Everything from the direction of the approach to the height of the carved composition to the color of the stone was understood in advance and incorporated into a designed experience. And then they left. Not suddenly, not completely, not without leaving the physical record that still stands, but the understanding that animated the design, the sense of what it meant to arrive here, what it meant to see this, what should happen to a person standing in this specific spot, facing this specific carved facade. That understanding is gone. The facade is still here. The stone holds the light the same way it always has. The proportions are still precise. The carved figures in the upper story still face outward across the open area below. But whoever the figures represent, whatever they meant to the people who commissioned them, whatever the treasury was supposed to communicate to the arriving merchant, the pilgrim, the foreign dignitary who had traveled weeks to reach this point, we do not know. We stand where 2,000 years of visitors have stood, looking at a building whose exterior we have measured to the millimeter, and we are still, in the most important sense, outside it. What does it mean to build something this precise, in this place, for reasons we have not been able to recover?